Cut and dried. That is it.
I'd like some legal representation. These police officers have not allowed me to have any. I don't know what this is all about.
Kill the president?
No, sir, I didn't. People keep asking me that. Sir?
You shoot the president?
I work in that building.
Were you in the building at the time?
Naturally, if I work in that building, yes, sir.
Back up, man. Did you shoot the president?
No, they're taking me in because of the fact that I lived in the Soviet Union. I'm just a patsy.
What a lot of people don't know about Oswald is that he was actually a world-class athlete with mutant abilities. After getting dropped off at his house, Speed and Lee ran an incredible 8 miles in just 16 minutes to shoot Officer Tippit at 10th and Patton. He did this with the help of a shorter, fatter Oswald in a blue coat via his duplication ability. After killing Tippit, Oswald made his way to the Texas Theater to watch a movie. Theater manager Butch Burroughs stated that Oswald entered around 1 o'clock and 1:17 p.m., although Tippit was shot at 1:16. Plus, Tippit's body arrived at the hospital at 1:15 p.m. This may be explained by a potential break in the space-time continuum. According to witnesses, Oswald also used duplication to produce a pockmarked Mexican in the school book depository, and an Oswald with heavy eyebrows behind the picket fence before zipping down 5 flights of stairs in 90 seconds to get a Coke. Bullshit aside, Oswald passed a paraffin test determining he had no gunpowder residue on his hands, but I guess that didn't matter by the time they had their patsy. If Oswald wasn't Kennedy's assassin, then who the hell was he? The official story is that Oswald was a communist who defected to the Soviet Union. However, it's more likely that he was part of a false defection program to get a spy into the USSR, which may have something to do with the consistent evidence that Oswald was in fact 2 different people. That's a story for another time. If he was a spook, then his defection in '59 would align with the activation of AE Balcony, which was a CIA project to send Baltic language-speaking U.S. spies to Soviet-controlled countries under the guise of commercial travel. Oswald had left the Marines on what is called a dependency discharge, meaning he was allowed to exit his military service in order to care for his injured mother, although there is no evidence that Marguerite was ever in need of care, as Oswald spent a mere 3 days with her before ditching for Europe. Oswald allegedly left to attend the Albert Schweitzer College in Switzerland, instead heading to Finland to obtain a Soviet visa. The college president of Albert Schweitzer was Percival Brundage, who was also Eisenhower's budget director, and an advocate of black budget financing for intelligence operations. He was also an operator of Southern Air Transport, which was the CIA's airline in the Caribbean during the 60s. Oswald himself put on his application for the Leslie Welding Company that he had worked for the State Department in Moscow. For some reason, the Office of Naval Intelligence pulled Oswald's security file 8 days before the assassination, and beforehand Reuben Efron had been routinely checking his mail under the direction of James Angleton. In 1979, CIA accountant James Wilcott claimed that while stationed in Tokyo, he had heard from at least 7 people that Lee Harvey Oswald was a regular employee with a salary for the CIA. What gives credit to Wilcott's story is the fact that he also recalled the name of Robert Shashima, a double agent for Japan and the U.S., whose existence was only disclosed in the 90s. Wilcott claims that a case officer came up to his window, telling him in the ensuing conversation that the money withdrawn was for the Oswald project or just for Oswald. HSCA staff notes suggest that Wilcott knew more than he was allowed to say in executive session, and that he believed there was a reference to Oswald or the Oswald project in CIA financial records. Similarly, Dallas policeman Roger Craig claims that before leaving the sheriff's office, someone told him that Oswald was an informant for the FBI, paid $200 a month, and that his code was S172. Senior CIA counterintelligence officer Tenant H. Bagley concluded that Oswald was a false defector. His analysis was based on documents shown to him by British researcher Malcolm J. Blunt, which indicated that the incoming non-CIA cables about Oswald's defection were routed not to the typical Soviet-Russia division, but instead to Bruce Soley's mole-hunting office in the Office of Security. William Kent was chief of psychological warfare at the JM Wave Station in Miami. Kent was familiar with the activities of anti-Castro groups like the Directorio Revolucionario Estudiantil, which had contact with Oswald in New Orleans. According to interviews with Kent's daughter, when asked about Oswald, Kent described him as a useful idiot. When further pressed about who killed JFK, Kent replied, "It's better you don't know." The Army is known to have destroyed an intelligence dossier maintained on Oswald. Declassified records and CIA historians indicate that GPFLOOR was the cryptonym used for Oswald in post-assassination investigations, serving as a slug for Oswald-related files. When Oswald entered the Texas theater, despite there being plenty of vacant seats, he reportedly sat right next to someone, before getting up to sit right next to someone else, repeatedly doing this until sitting next to a pregnant woman who would speak with him. When he was arrested, he had $2 half in his pocket. This is a known spy technique whereby a contact is identified in having the other half of the bill. Theater manager Butch Burroughs told Jim Douglas that on the day of the assassination he saw not one but 2 Oswalds being arrested, one being dragged out the front of the theater, and one about 4 minutes later being led out the back. Oswald was arrested on the lower floor of the theater. However, the police report of L.D. Stringfellow details Oswald's arrest from the balcony. Bernard Hare owned Bernie's Hobby House, doors down from the theater. He recalled Oswald wearing dark slacks and being escorted without cuffs through the alley behind his shop. While in custody, Oswald asked to make a phone call to a John Hurt in North Carolina, which was written down by a secretary. When Oswald got on the phone, the Secret Service intervened, and the excuse was made that they couldn't get through. Another secretary picked up the note from the trash, turning it over to the police several years later, discovering that John Hurt was a former military intelligence officer. He lived about 150 miles away from the Nags Head base on the Outer Banks in North Carolina. Nags Head was also the base from which the ONI launched its false defector program into the Soviet Union. With all this considered, it only naturally follows that there were plenty of spooks in Oswald's family. Oswald's cousin, Marilyn Murrett, was outed to reporter Paul Scott, who wrote an article in which he named her in a long list of people alleged to be Soviet spies. The FBI pulled Marilyn's passport, finding she made many unusual trips around the world, first claiming to be a reservationist for a travel company, later claiming to be a teacher. Marilyn traveled to countries including England, France, Germany, Holland, China, and various Eastern Bloc countries. The yearbook information on Marilyn Murrett depicts this woman, but the picture of her at Louisiana State University in 1948 looks more like Ruth Payne, Oswald's neighbor. Oswald's aunt Lillian Murrett flew to an Air Force base in Bermuda in 1954, which is sandwiched between the issuance of Marilyn's passport and the travels that the FBI was following her on. Oswald had a first cousin named Floy Oswald, who J. Edgar Hoover had a personal file on. Floy Oswald would be murdered in her house by a caretaker and 2 friends who attempted to make her sign over property rights. Most notably, there is evidence to suggest that, like Oswald, his mother Marguerite was part of naval intelligence. Marguerite stated to the Warren Commission that she was a phone operator for the Navy in 1942, probably for the Waves program during the war. The training program for Waves was in the Bronx, which makes sense since Robert Oswald Sr.'s ex-wife, Hazel, told the FBI that after Robert died in '39, the family moved to New York. In 1953, the House on Un-American Activities in New York had a 960-page file concerning Marguerite Oswald, Nazis, and New Jersey. The Assassination Records Review Board were denied access to this document. Despite supposedly being broke, Marguerite Oswald was the landlord of 3 different houses and would be linked to the ownership of numerous properties across the country. However, there are no records of her tenants or anyone who remembers her from some of the areas she supposedly lived at. In 1942, Marguerite would leave Lee with her sister Lillian, who gave him up to an orphanage. After this, the FBI would try to verify her residential and work history from '42 and '44 without success, as many of the records had been destroyed. Marguerite claimed to the Warren Commission that during this time she was working as a phone operator for the Pittsburgh Glass Company. The timing of when Marguerite Oswald left Lee with Lillian coincides with the time she met and married Edwin Ekdahl. Edwin Ekdahl was in New York City at the time working for Abasco. One of Abasco's projects was the design of a large electrical generation station in the Soviet Union. When Abasco was questioned to provide information about Edwin, they told the FBI they were unable to do so. This should demonstrate how high up in intelligence they were. Although she claimed to have been working in Louisiana, the addresses linked to Marguerite at this time are also addresses in New York. 227 Atlantic Avenue is in Staten Island. Before that, she was at 2136 Broadway, which is the location of the Beacon Hotel, 20 minutes away from where Edwin Ekdahl lived at the time. Marguerite Oswald's uncle was Paul Auguste Voitier Jr., who was a bodyguard of Louisiana Senator Huey Long, who was assassinated by his own bodyguards in 1935. Fred Korth was Secretary of the Navy and Assistant Secretary to the Army. He was also Edwin Ekdahl's lawyer. According to a memo, Marguerite Oswald revealed that Lee's discharge from the Marines was handled by Fred Korth and that the house in which Marguerite had been living during the assassination, 222 Thomas Place, belonged to Mary McCarthy, a close friend of Fred Korth. She also noted that Fred Korth played a part in Lee's life but didn't explain any further. Fred Korth's cousin was married to Roy Truly, the boss of the Texas School Book Depository. Oswald had an uncle called Charles Dutz Murrett, who was a bookkeeper for Carlos Marcello. Dutz was also an associate of Sam Saya, one of the leaders of organized crime in New Orleans. Another of Murrett's associates, Nofio Pecora, was linked to Jack Ruby. An FBI informant named Joseph Hauser got Marcello to admit to having known both Murrett and Oswald. There is also some FBI reports on Eugene Sumner, who saw Oswald at a Marcello underboss's restaurant collecting money. As you can see, the repurposing of one unwitting spook is all it takes to cover for why we lost the only non-kosher president. Still, there are plenty of plot holes throughout Oswald's setup as a communist. Before defecting, he allegedly traveled to Mexico to pick up a Soviet visa. The bus which took Oswald to Mexico City left from New Orleans on September the 35th at 1:45. His visa is stamped entering the country on September 26th. However, according to an FBI informant at the Postal Service, on September 26th, Oswald was in New Orleans submitting a change of address form and an application for a new P.O. box. This document was never mentioned in the Warren Commission. The same day Oswald is meant to have applied for his travel visa to Mexico City, September 17th, two other individuals had also applied for travel to Mexico out of the same New Orleans office. They were David Pierce Magyar, an associate of David Ferry, and William Gaudet, who worked for Clay Shaw's International Trade Mart and admitted to investigators to being a contract agent for the CIA in Latin America. Gaudet is also the man responsible for Oswald's TV interview. Having seen Oswald handing out leaflets, he phoned an associate, Jesse Corr, who was head of PR at Shaw's International Trade Mart. Corr phoned John Corporon, the news director at WDSU-TV, who sent a news crew to Oswald's location in front of the Trade Mart. It is during this interview Oswald will proclaim himself as a Marxist-Leninist. According to the Warren Commission, Oswald applied for a 6-month Mexican visa but received a 15-day visa, which requires a completely different application. The visa itself presented by the Warren Commission can't be authentic. As revealed by the clerk at the Mexican consulate, she was certain that the FBI never collected it as evidence, as it had been lost in a fire in 1965. Oswald's conversation with the Soviet embassy was recorded on October 1st. According to the transcript, Oswald can be observed speaking in broken Russian, which is inconsistent with what we know of Oswald as a fluent Russian speaker. These are the alleged photos taken by the FBI of Oswald at the Mexican and Cuban embassies.
Really, nigga?
Other than his defection to the Soviet Union, allegations that he was a communist relied mainly on his affiliation with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, which he was filmed handing out leaflets for in New Orleans. On the leaflets which Oswald had been handing out was the address 544 Camp Street, New Orleans. This was also the office of Carlos Bringuier, who Oswald supposedly got into a fight with, then debated on WDSU. Around the corner from 544 Camp Street, located in the same building, was 531 Lafayette Street, which housed the detective agency run by Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister was an ex-FBI agent who ran a private detective agency out of New Orleans. In 1963, Bannister and David Ferry began working for the lawyer G. Ray Gill and his client, Carlos Marcello. This involved attempts to block Marcello's deportation to Guatemala by RFK. In 1963, Bannister and fellow detective Jack Martin went drinking together. On their return to Bannister's office, the two men got into an argument over a missing file, leading to Bannister pistol whipping Martin with a Magnum revolver, sending him to the hospital. Over the next few days, Martin told friends that Bannister and David Ferry had been involved in the assassination of Kennedy. He also claimed that Ferry knew Lee Harvey Oswald from their days in the Civil Air Patrol. This information reached Jim Garrison, who interviewed Martin about these accusations. Martin claimed that in 1963, Bannister and David Ferry were involved in something very sinister with a group of Cuban exiles. Delphine Roberts, who later became Bannister's mistress, told Anthony Summers that during the summer of '63, Lee Harvey Oswald worked for Bannister. She said she was even in the office when Bannister suggested that Oswald establish a local Fair Play for Cuba committee. This story was supported by her daughter, who met Oswald during this period. After Bannister's death of coronary thrombosis, FPCC leaflets were found in his office. The FPCC was formed in 1960 before Castro had embraced communism. The Wikipedia page for the FPCC omits this and any mention of a founder. However, putting the link in the Wayback Machine reveals that at a time it had credited Vincent T. Lee as having formed the group. This, however, is also false. The group was really founded by Robert Tabor and Richard Gibson, two CBS journalists. With CBS itself as a creature of the CIA under Operation Mockingbird aside, Richard Gibson was revealed in a record dump to have worked for the CIA with a salary of $900 per month. When Castro went red in '61, it was then when Tabor and Gibson handed the FPCC off to Vincent T. Lee. Shortly after, the two were interviewed by the CIA and FBI. In 1976, an article was published claiming that Oswald was in correspondence with Vincent Lee, who allegedly gave him an FPCC membership card. It also claimed that Vincent and Oswald had met in Tampa to plan his trip to Mexico to acquire a Cuban and Soviet visa. However, this meeting took place long after Oswald's alleged trip to Mexico. Oswald allegedly wrote a letter to Vincent, dated August 1st, talking about how some exiled Cubans attacked one of his demonstrations. This incident didn't take place till August 9th. Vincent Lee himself denied to the Warren Commission that he had known Oswald, or that he had made him chapter of any New Orleans branch of the FPCC, but did recall receiving the letters to his own confusion. Garrison investigator Harold Weisberg visited Jones Printing, where the FPCC leaflets had originated. The name on the order for the leaflets was Leon Osborne. After showing the owner, Douglas Jones, hundreds of photographs, Jones picked out 4 identifying the man who had made the order. Jones rejected a picture of Oswald, instead identifying a man with a full beard. This was Kerry Thornley, a Marine who had served briefly with Oswald in Atsugi. In 1959, Thornley had served for a short time in the same radar operator unit as Oswald at El Toro, where the two would discuss politics. He was in the classes in the weeks behind Oswald, which went through the exact same schedule. Fellow Marine Ronald Schwinghammer observed someone called Rick Thornley, claiming to be a professional writer, inquiring about Oswald's unit and interviewing him for a book he was writing called The Idle Warrior. Schwinghammer puts Thornley in Atsugi in 1960. However, according to Thornley himself, he didn't find out about Oswald's defection until he was on his way home from Atsugi in October of that year. In his affidavit to Jim Garrison, Thornley writes, "As Oswald had been, I became an outspoken critic of U.S. foreign policy. As Oswald had done, I began to disobey orders and ridicule my military superiors, and as had Oswald, I began espousing Marxist doctrines." If all of this sounds weird, it's because Thornley would go on to become a leading figure in the Discordian movement under the alias Omar Khayyam Ravenhurst. The point of Discordianism is to instigate chaos, regardless of any consistent value. Thornley was sent back to the States from Atsugi, allegedly because he won an instructor technique course competition, moving to New Orleans in February of 1961, which coincides with the start of a long series of Oswald impersonations, many of which occurred while Oswald was provably in the Soviet Union. This starts with the incident at Bolton Ford, with Lawrence Howard, who Thornley mentions as Leopoldo in his confession letter to Jim Garrison. Leopoldo was also the name used by Howard while visiting Sylvia Odio. Thornley, in fact, knew Oswald in Texas after his time in the Marines. Barbara Glancy Reed encountered Thornley and Oswald together, remarking to Jim Garrison that after Thornley's trip to Mexico City, he had cut his hair short, causing the two to look like twins. Oswald's neighbors responded positively to pictures of Thornley, some stating that they had seen him going to the grocery store with Marina so often that they thought he was her husband, and were confused by Oswald's picture in the papers. In his affidavit to Garrison, Thornley admitted to having traveled to Mexico City in September of '63, the same time Oswald was meant to be in Mexico. Thornley implied to Garrison that it seemed odd that the ONI could find no references to Oswald or him in its files, and that in his opinion they must have been either stolen, displaced, or destroyed. Thornley also implied that if naval intelligence were keeping an eye on him, and if they had assigned him a babysitter, then that man must have been Bud Simcoe. There are multiple Bud Simcoes locatable on Google, all of which have military backgrounds, however none of which match the timeline at hand. Thornley claimed in his affidavit to Garrison to having befriended a man named Roderick R. Brooks, aka Slim. Slim in turn introduced Thornley to someone called Gary Kirstein. Thornley would later state his belief that these two men were in fact Jerry Milton Brooks and E. Howard Hunt. Thornley hired a young lady named Joyce Talley to type up his book. She allegedly liked it so much that she introduced him to her college professor, Martin McAuliffe. McAuliffe had been the PR manager for Sergio Arcacha Smith when he worked for Friends of Democratic Cuba. Thornley states that having gotten to know him, McAuliffe introduced him to Guy Bannister to talk about his book. At which point Garrison writes in the column of the affidavit, "Too much." He also states that on a day shortly after Christmas, Slim took him for a ride around town in what was alleged to have been Carlos Marcello's car, implying that he knew the Marcellos and that Gary had been cultivating the friendship. According to Thornley, the two would repeatedly engage him in hypotheticals about assassinating the president and how he would go about planning it. In one conversation, the issue arose of who to blame it on. Thornley suggested framing a communist, to which Gary smiled. Now let's get into some of the numerous other Oswald sightings leading up to the assassination. Sylvia Odio was the daughter of two prominent anti-Castro activists who had been jailed in Cuba in 1963. Odio claimed that she had met Oswald and two Cubans who had showed up at her home to try and get her to write letters to solicit funds for anti-Castro revolutionaries. She recalled that one of the Cubans went by Leopoldo, and Oswald went by his pseudonym, Leon. Leon was the same name used by Carrie Thornley to print the FPCC leaflets. Funnily enough, Perry Russo recalled David Ferry having a roommate called Leon, who was described as a beatnik with a bushy beard and hair which was all messed up. In his affidavit, Thornley mentioned struggling to find a job on account of his full beard. A day after their visit, Leopoldo called her, asking what she thought of Oswald, to whom she didn't have much of an opinion. At the time of these events in September, Oswald is meant to be in New Orleans. Lawrence Howard, on the other hand, admitted to Garrison to traveling to Dallas with Loren Hall, arriving on September 20th. What's more, Loren Hall confirmed to the FBI that he, Howard, and Seymour had visited Odio's apartment. Hall would later try desperately to recant this statement. On January 20, 1961, a time when Oswald is known to have been in the Soviet Union, Oscar Deslate, a sales manager at Bolton Ford in New Orleans, was approached by two men who were interested in purchasing several vehicles on behalf of FDC. One was described as a heavy-set pockmarked Latin with a scar over his left eye. When shown a picture of Oswald, Deslate did not identify him as the man he had encountered. Harvey Wade was a businessman who visited the Carousel Club. There he observed who he believed to be Oswald in the company of two other men. One was a dark-complected man, about 200 pounds, with bumps on his face and a scar on his left eyebrow. After his return from Mexico, Oswald would visit an employment center in Dallas where he meets with a woman called Laura Kittrell. Kittrell describes Oswald as a biker type with violent tendencies, who at one point slammed his fist on the desk so hard it caused a vase to tip over before storming out yelling obscenities. Kittrell will later go on to identify this man to Jim Garrison as having been Larry Crayford, a drifter who worked for Jack Ruby at the Carousel Club. Bill Boxley, one of Garrison's investigators, described Crayford's testimony as textbook quality for any intelligence services course in resistance to interrogation. Oswald was seen in September of '63 at the Havana bar in New Orleans with a stocky Latin man who ordered tequila while Oswald ordered lemonade. The timing of this event coincides with the travels of Howard and Seymour between Dallas, LA, New Orleans, and Miami. On September 28th, Oswald was allegedly at the Sportsdrome firing range, while the official story simultaneously places him in Mexico City. The gun used by Oswald at the range was described to be an Argentine Mauser. Garland Slack had observed Oswald at the range on the 10th, the same day that Oswald was seen at the Carousel Club. Oswald was observed being passed 3 rifles through the fence of the firing range, as opposed to the entrance, by a large man with a beard. Waddell Robertson lived near Oswald's home in Fort Worth, Texas. He told the FBI that in December of '63 he witnessed who he believed to have been Oswald firing at targets from his backyard. However, at the time of this account, Oswald would have been in New Orleans, moving back to Texas on October 3rd. Oswald reportedly arrived for a job interview at the KOPY radio station in a gray beat-up car, although there is no evidence that Oswald had ever owned or driven a car. Witnesses to this meeting would describe Oswald as having several days of unshaved stubble. According to Perry Russo, the man he had known as Leon had shaved his beard sometime in September, leaving only whiskers. Oswald also tried getting a job at the State Louisiana Hospital, the same hospital which Jack Martin had been admitted to for extreme exposure to LSD, the same hospital which Rose Cherami would be admitted to, and the same hospital where Oswald's mad aunt had been sent. Oswald talked to Reeves Morgan, the state representative from East Feliciana Parish, who told him he would only be obliged to recommend him if he registered in his parish and was on the voting rolls. It was for this reason that Oswald was spotted at the Clinton voter registration in a gray Plymouth with David Ferry and Clay Shaw. Alvine Magee was a landlord who met with Oswald about renting a room. She recalled Oswald arriving in a light-colored station wagon. When he got out of the car, he proceeded to tell her his life story, how he spent 3 years in Russia, how he was a Marxist, then had to explain to her what a Marxist was. He also asked if she had good locks on the apartment to house his collection of guns, even mentioning that one had a telescopic sight. As Oswald left, he made a passing comment. "I hear Kennedy's going to make a tour down the southern states." The rifle Oswald allegedly used was a Carcano, which was linked to him via a money order and a photograph of him holding it with communist propaganda in his other hand. This photograph has been scrutinized for irregularities from Oswald's unnatural posture to the shading on his face. Stephen Jaffe, a photographic analyst for Jim Garrison, seemed to believe that a single shot of Oswald's head had been superimposed onto the incriminating picture in question, which can be gleaned from overlapping the two. The photo itself was taken by Marina Oswald and posted by Kerry Thornley. As for the money order, Oswald's was printed on paper, as the ink had bled through to the other side, whereas in 1963, all U.S. postal money orders were printed on hard cardstock. The edges are frayed when they should be rigid, and it lacks the proper banking stamps on the side. What's more, the money order was purchased on March 12, 1963, but according to the Warren Commission, was deposited into Klein's bank account on February 15, a month before the money order was purchased. This discredits both CIA associate George de Mohrenschildt and the Paynes as witnesses, who claimed to have seen Oswald with the rifle. George de Mohrenschildt was Oswald's only friend in Dallas. He would later confess in a Newsweek article that Oswald was introduced to him at the instigation of a CIA agent. Shortly after giving this interview, de Mohrenschildt would be found dead from a gunshot to the head. Although ruled a suicide, the sheriff's report mentions that in his last month, he had expressed feelings of persecution from unspecified Jewish elements. Former police sniper Brian Edwards pointed out that the Carcano that Oswald allegedly ordered was not the same version allegedly in his possession. Also, he could have ordered more ammo and a 6-shot magazine, yet he did not, which doesn't explain where he got the rest of the ammunition from. Without that magazine, he would have to have loaded the bullets manually. We know he had a clip because it can be seen in a picture with Lieutenant Day. If Oswald fired 3 shots but 4 bullets were found, then where is the rest of the 46 bullets that were sold together? In the investigation, the FBI states it was unable to determine where or when Oswald got the ammunition. Postal Inspector Harry Holmes could not find any postal employee who remembered giving such a package to Oswald. Additionally, Oswald ordered the rifle under the debunked alias of Alec Heidel and had it shipped to his Dallas post office box. However, his application for the box did not list Alec Heidel as an authorized recipient. Oswald allegedly used a revolver to kill Officer J.D. Tippett during his escape from Dealey Plaza. Oswald's revolver was allegedly picked up on March 20th. However, the receipt for the pickup was signed by someone called Paxton. The only thing linking the gun to Oswald is the notice for in-person pickup said to have been delivered to Oswald's mailbox in Dallas. Yet there is no evidence of this notice's existence, as no one has been able to produce a copy of it. Oswald is said to have rented a room at 621 North Marsalis in Dallas from a woman named Mary Bledsoe. Coincidentally, Bledsoe is also one of the 2 witnesses who will attempt to place Oswald on the Dallas transit bus. Bledsoe's testimony includes lines like, "I'm not supposed to know about things. The only time I was not watching him," and "I forget what I have to say." Her worst fuck-up was mentioning a hole in Oswald's sleeve and that all his buttons were torn off, resulting from his scuffle with the police in the theater. This took place after the bus incident. Apparently, Mary Bledsoe had notes in her testimony, which she said she needed because she forgot what she was meant to say. Mary Bledsoe had a cousin called Jewel Germany Jr., who was an Air Force officer. Germany had a cousin called R.D. Matthews, who was a known associate of Jack Ruby. In October of '63, Ruby placed a call to Matthews' home. What's also suspicious is that Mary's son, Porter, was in the Civil Air Patrol and trained by David Ferry. After spending a week at 621 North Marsalis, Oswald allegedly rents a room from Gladys Johnson at 1026 North Beckley in Oak Cliff. Housekeeper Erlene Roberts puts Oswald at North Beckley from October 14th through to November 22nd. However, Ruth Payne puts Oswald at her residence in Irving, Texas throughout that time. Erlene Roberts had a sister called Bertha Cheek, a businesswoman involved mainly with housing and real estate, who had previously been involved in the nightclub business. During this time, she had become a friend and associate of Jack Ruby, and had even spent several hours with him at the Carousel Club. The Dallas police collected around 230 pieces of evidence from Oswald's place. On November 23rd, the FBI came and confiscated all of it, returning them to the Dallas police with an additional 220 items, including 10-year-old tax documents and employment cards. Researcher John Armstrong found that these tax documents had all been typed on the same typewriter.